The first reading is from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. Listen now for a word from God. When God began to create heaven and the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovered over the waters. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness God called night. And it was evening, and it was morning, first day. The second reading is from Revelations chapter 21, verses 1 through 5. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be God's people, and God will be with them. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." And God said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." The word of God for the peace of God. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Joe. Pray with me. Spirit, we give thanks for the ways that you are moving among us. The Spirit who hovered over the waters of creation, you are with us. You are here. So may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So I just want to do a little visualization exercise with you all. So if you could join me in closing your eyes for a moment, and we are going to be transported to a very, very different place from Glen Cove. So I want you to picture a dirt road. There's lots and lots of trees around the road. Think a wooded area with an occasional large open field. And you're in a car driving down this dirt road, and you come upon one of these open fields. And there you see donkeys and some goats grazing. And then you see a small one-story brick home that lies on the edge of that open field. You can open your eyes. This, friends, is my first childhood home. And I'm probably going to take you here often, so I want you to have this visual. I lived here with my mom and my grandparents, whom I called my nanny and papa. I want you to know when I talk about my nanny, I'm not talking about someone that we hired. We didn't have that kind of money. But this was a home where there were many constants. That probably among the most important constants was there was always sweet tea. There was lots of hugs, and there was definitely Jesus, at least a certain kind of Jesus. So you see, something that really shaped my earliest childhood memories was that my papa called it that good old time religion. And one of the ways that this showed up for me was in bedtime stories. Of course, in this kind of home, we had to have Christian bedtime stories usually. So while there was probably some room for diversity in what we read, one of the memories that I can really hang on to still of these bedtime stories was when my nanny was reading to me the creation story. It's from a children's Bible, so it wasn't, like the story we would read in the actual Bible. But I'm pretty sure it wasn't my first time hearing this story. But this particular night, there was something different. Because at this point, I knew that there were dinosaurs. I had learned that in school. And so as she's reading me this story, there's some cognitive dissonance happening for me. there are no dinosaurs in this story. So I said, Nanny, where are the dinosaurs? And she was very kind and gracious and patient with me. She said, I'm not really sure, but I know that God made them. It was an honest answer on her part, and she didn't try to solve the timeline for me. And at that time, I was satisfied with the answer. I said, okay, sure, that makes sense, whatever. But as I continued in my faith journey, I had decided, this is fast forward several years, I'm going to college at this point, and I went to a conservative Pentecostal university. So think really conservative in many ways. Probably not as bad as you can imagine, but we're inching that way. And so for me, I really identified as a conservative Christian. I mean, I didn't think of it as conservative, I just thought of it as Christian. And at a minimum, this meant for me that the Bible was literally true. And that certainly included Genesis 1. Now you can imagine that this would have created even more cognitive dissonance when I was sitting in my astronomy and earth science class and we were talking about rocks that were millions of years old. That definitely was a little problematic for me at the time. But it was in college that I also began to think about what the story actually meant. It wasn't just about what was the story, but what were the implications of the story. And that's when I learned a phrase that some of you probably are already familiar with, but it's what theologians call creation ex nihilo, which simply means out of nothing. Christians have used this expression for a long, long time to talk about creation. And it's important for them because it's a statement about the way that God created. This idea that God created the entirety of the cosmos out of nothing. But what does that mean? And why does that even matter? Well, I imagine that for many Christian theologians, it's important for them because they want to say that God was the first one here and there was nothing else, and God is the source of all that is. And I remember being told explicitly that creation ex nihilo was the only way that we could read these narratives. But the irony for me is that when you actually read the creation narrative, it doesn't actually start with creation ex nihilo. When we actually take a moment and pause and read the text with a close eye, I think that they're actually guiding us to a notion that is beyond ex nihilo, towards a notion that is, for me, even more profound and perhaps even more necessary for us to think about today. So, I know for most of us, if you're like me, you probably read this text and you're like, I've heard this 1,000 times. What is there more to say about it? But I invite you today to join me on a journey and to slow down. Let's look at this text anew with fresh eyes. So, as I said, probably most of us can recite the opening passage, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and on and on and on, right? It's familiar, it's timeless. But the phrase that we translate formless and void is actually a bit of an obscure Hebrew expression, and it's a bit difficult to translate. But Robert Adler, who translated the text that Joe actually read for us, that's his translation. He's a professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California in Berkeley. He translates this opening passage as when God began to create the heaven and the earth was welter and waste. So when I read that, I'd say, that gives me a little bit of a different sense of the text. First of all, I notice when God began to create rather than God created. One sounds like a past tense, one and done, we're all over. The other sounds like this is an ongoing thing, right? So the poem then becomes a story of when God began this work rather than when God finished this work. And Adler's words differ in another really important way for me. Instead of formless and void, Adler translates it as welter and waste. So I'll be honest with you, welter was a new word for me. I said, what in the world is welter? but it simply means a state of wild disorder, chaotic mass, a jumble. This is such a different picture for me. The creation poem doesn't begin with God creating out of nothing. Rather, God is interacting with something that is already in existence. God is interacting with a welter and waste earth. It's an earth that's in a state of disorder. It's an earth that the creator of this poem at least looks at and says is a wasteland. How did this happen? Was there some kind of incident that occurred to make the earth like this? We're not given the insight as readers, and I don't think that's what the creator or originator of this poem is really trying to talk about. But what we are given as readers is that God chooses to become invested in something that's disordered, in something that's looked at as a wasteland. God looks at the wasteland and sees it as something of potential, something that can become. So what was God doing before this? What about this disordered wasteland inspired God enough for God to create? The poem doesn't really tell us much about God's motives, but it does explicitly state for us how God perceives the creation. So before God moves any further in the story, God says, "Let there be light." What does light do for us? Light helps us to see things. It helps us to get a clearer sense of what is and how we can move about that space. God sees that light and God says that it's good. And God gives structure to the light. So now there's day and night, and thus we have the first day. So I think that it's important to note here what happens when God sees the light. Right? God takes it in, God observes it, God experiences the light and calls it good. The light is going to make this disordered wasteland even more visible for God to see. And it will make a way forward for God to continue to create. And God gets pleasure out of this experience. God sees that the light is good, and God continues to create and find delight in the creative process. I mean, can you get in God's boat here for a second? Can you remember the last time that you created something and took delight in it? Can you remember looking at something? I mean, yesterday I made some no-bake cookies and I said, "That's good," right? When was the last time you did that? Like, can you just imagine that experience? What does that tell us about what the poet thinks about God? A God who takes delight. This is a different story to me than creation ex nihilo. You see, I don't read the story through my childhood eyes anymore. I'm not really worried about it and telling me about the scientific beginnings of the earth. But what I do see now is that there's something good and beautiful that God makes out of a mess. I read this story and I realize that God is a God who knows how to enjoy beauty. I read this story and I see a God who looks at a disordered wasteland and says, this can be something better. This can be something beautiful. What kind of God is this? Well, I think at a minimum, it's a God who sees potential where many don't. So I think the question for us today is, where do we look out and see a disordered wasteland? Maybe you look at your life and you say, there's plenty of disordered wasteland here. And if you were to say that, I think you're probably in good company. I think most of us can point to something in our lives that's a little less than what we want. We may question whether or not something good can come from it. We may feel that there are parts of us that are really wounded. We may not even be ready to name that. We may be afraid that we're too broken for goodness, for pleasure, or for beauty. Maybe it's your family. You look at your family and wonder, will anything good come out of this mess? Maybe some of you are looking towards Thanksgiving dinner and wondering, what are those conversations going to be like this year? But I imagine most of us are certainly looking at our country right now, and we're wondering, honestly, what will the future look like? We feel like there's a little bit of a mess right now. Can there be beauty here? Can there be connection? Can there be hope? Can there be goodness? Can we take pleasure in one another as fellow humans? Can we move beyond a polarized tribalism? Is there a way to take what feels like chaos and build something that we take pleasure in again? And maybe you see a disordered wasteland when you look at the earth. I mean, a lot of us, if we've been watching the news, we've seen wildfires decimate homes in California. We've seen parts of the rainforest down in South America be decimated. We've seen hurricanes destroy cities, and trash is filling our oceans. I mean, the list can go on and on. And I look at that and I say, how long can the earth survive this? The earth is probably going to survive it longer than we will, though, is the reality. So is there a way forward for us to look at this disorder and make goodness here? So friends, as we look at the days ahead, I think we're all asking questions. We're all trying to say, how can we make something good here? And we all have different ways of coping with these wastelands, right? Some of us find it easier to ignore them. Sometimes it's a little easier to just go home and watch some TV. And that's okay sometimes. And some of us feel the need to aggressively attack the wasteland. And sometimes we may need to get a little aggression out. But I think here in this story, what we find is another way forward. I think that this story, this Genesis story, invites us to join, to be a partner with the Creator, to be like the Creator. Of course, none of us are going to create an entirely new earth. If you know how to do that, please let me know, because we can probably make a lot of money. But what we can do is we can look at the disordered wastelands around us. We can take responsibility for what is within our sphere of influence. We can become co-creators with God. One of my new favorite theologians, Jennifer L. Baldwin, writes this. She says, creation of worlds, creation of a life or oneself, it doesn't occur out of nothing. It happens when we actually embrace the messy chaos, when we engage our creativity, and when we draw on the energy of the chaos to create from what is present. Friends, we don't get the luxury of having a blank canvas to create something here. We already have so much in front of us, and that's not a bad thing. In fact, God is probably looking at it and saying, this is the perfect canvas. So friends, I invite you as individuals and as a community to step into our God-given nature as creators. The dark, chaotic places within us and around us do not mean our stories are over. Rather, these are the very places where God's breath, God's Spirit, is breathing something new. So let's get creative together. Pray with me. Spirit, we give thanks for the ways that you are moving in and among us, still here. We give thanks for the ways that your breath is inviting us into new places of creation. So would you help us to imagine? Help us to see new, powerful ways forward together as a community of faith. We trust that you are with us in this process. Help us to see with your eyes. Amen.